He wasn't chained to keep anyone away. He was chained because someone was terrified of what he might one day lead the world to find. Dawn settled softly over the rolling hills outside Ashford, Virginia, painting the fields in pale shades of gold, while a cool September breeze carried the scent of damp earth, cedar, and fading wildflowers across an abandoned stretch of farmland that most locals no longer bothered to remember. The old Whitmore property had stood empty for nearly 40 years, its weathered farmhouse leaning gently beneath the weight of forgotten seasons, broken windows staring across empty pasture like tired eyes that had witnessed far too much. Children were warned never to wander beyond the rusted gate. Older residents simply lowered their voices whenever its name surfaced, changing the subject before curiosity could grow into questions. Former Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker knew nothing of those stories. At 37, the former U.S. Marine had learned to distrust rumors and trust only what he could see with his own eyes. Years of service had carved discipline into every movement he made, but they had also left behind quieter scars that no uniform could conceal. His broad shoulders still carried the strength of countless training exercises, though his hazel eyes now held the thoughtful patience of a man who had spent too many nights listening to silence instead of sleep. Since leaving the Corps 2 years earlier, Ethan had taken restoration jobs across rural Virginia, repairing forgotten barns, clearing neglected trails, and helping old families reclaim pieces of land that time had nearly erased. It was honest work, slow work, the kind that allowed memories to settle instead of chase him. That morning his pickup rolled to a stop beside the rusted entrance after a nearby rancher mentioned loose fencing surrounding the abandoned property. Ethan stepped onto the gravel, stretching beneath the cool morning air before reaching into the truck for his tool bag. The breeze was calm enough that he immediately noticed something unusual. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, an unmistakable sense that someone, or something, was watching him from somewhere beyond the overgrown weeds. Then came the faint scrape of metal against stone. Slow, deliberate, almost patient. Ethan followed the sound beyond the collapsed fence line until the tall grass parted around a towering white oak whose branches spread wide enough to cast a circle of permanent shade across the forgotten ground beneath it. There, wrapped around the thick trunk, hung a rusted chain that disappeared into the shadows before ending at the worn leather collar of a magnificent German shepherd. The dog's sable coat was dulled by dust and weather, yet beneath the dirt Ethan could still see the proud lines of a powerful working dog. His amber eyes never blinked. They remained fixed on Ethan with an expression that wasn't fear, anger, or desperation. It was expectation, as though every sunrise for years had led to this exact moment. Ethan crouched slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Easy there, buddy." The shepherd neither barked nor backed away. His ears lifted slightly, and his tail remained perfectly still. Ethan noticed the heavy chain lying across the ground, orange with rust, its old iron links buried halfway beneath layers of fallen leaves and packed soil. It looked less like something fastened yesterday and more like something the earth itself had begun swallowing long ago. He examined the weathered padlock, shook his head quietly, and reached for the bolt cutters resting inside his bag. One clean squeeze echoed softly beneath the ancient oak. The lock gave way with a tired crack. The chain slipped free. Ethan stepped back, expecting the shepherd to sprint toward the open field and disappear into the woods. Instead, the dog simply stood there for a long moment, looking directly into Ethan's face before slowly turning toward the dense forest beyond the farmhouse. Without a single bark, he began walking into the trees, then stopped after only a few yards. He looked back once, his amber eyes calm, certain, and impossibly inviting, as if to ask a question no human had answered for decades. The German shepherd did not hurry. He moved with steady confidence, weaving through waist-high grass that brushed against Ethan Walker's boots while the early morning light filtered gently through towering oaks and maples whose leaves had already begun surrendering to autumn. Every few steps the dog paused just long enough to make certain Ethan was still following before continuing deeper into the forgotten woods. There was no fear in his movements, only quiet purpose. Ethan had seen military working dogs operate with similar discipline years earlier, reading terrain, tracking scents, and leading patrols through places where maps meant very little. This felt strangely familiar, yet different in a way he could not explain. There was no command being given, no handler issuing directions. Somehow the dog had assumed both roles at once. The forest swallowed the sounds of the distant highway until only birdsong, rustling leaves, and the faint crunch of dry branches beneath their feet remained. The cool air carried the earthy fragrance of moss, damp bark, and fallen pine needles. Sunbeams slipped through the canopy like narrow ribbons of gold, revealing tiny clouds of dust floating lazily between ancient trunks that had stood watch over these hills for generations. Nearly 300 yards from the abandoned farmhouse, the shepherd suddenly stopped beside an enormous stone outcrop covered in thick green moss. He lowered his head, sniffed carefully around the base of the rocks, then circled once before looking directly at Ethan again. His amber eyes never seemed anxious. Instead, they reflected something almost impossible to describe. Hope. Ethan slowly approached the area, studying the ground. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Fallen branches, layers of leaves, a scattering of weathered stones half buried beneath decades of soil. He crouched, brushing aside loose leaves with the back of his glove. The earth beneath them looked oddly uneven, as though someone long ago had disturbed the ground before nature patiently reclaimed it. Before Ethan could examine it further, the shepherd placed one large paw gently against the soil, not digging wildly, not scratching for attention, simply resting it there with remarkable precision. Ethan felt an unexpected chill despite the warming morning. He looked toward the dog again. "You have been here before, have you not?" he whispered. The shepherd blinked once. It was enough to make Ethan reach for the small folding shovel secured inside his truck bag, which he had carried almost out of habit. He pushed aside another layer of leaves and carefully loosened several inches of soft earth. Almost immediately the shovel struck something solid. It was not stone. The sound was unmistakably metallic. Ethan stopped digging. Years of military experience had taught him patience whenever something unexpected appeared beneath the surface. Kneeling lower, he used only his gloved hands to remove the remaining dirt until the corner of a rusted steel box slowly emerged from the ground. It was rectangular, heavily weathered, and coated with decades of reddish-brown corrosion. Thick roots had begun wrapping themselves around its edges as though the forest itself had tried protecting whatever rested inside. Ethan stared silently. The shepherd stepped closer, lowering himself onto the ground beside the box without making a sound. His breathing remained calm, his gaze fixed upon the old container. It almost seemed as though he had completed a responsibility he had carried for longer than anyone could imagine. Ethan gently brushed away the remaining dirt until faded military green paint became barely visible beneath the rust. One weathered marking still clung stubbornly to the metal. 2 letters. U.S. His heartbeat slowed. Whatever this was, it did not belong to the abandoned farmhouse alone. It belonged to someone whose story had never truly ended. And somewhere inside the quiet forest, beneath the whispering branches that had guarded this place for decades, the morning suddenly felt less like the beginning of another ordinary workday and far more like the first page of a forgotten chapter waiting for someone willing to read it. For several long seconds, Ethan Walker simply knelt beside the weathered steel box, listening to the forest breathe around him. Somewhere high above, a red-tailed hawk circled through the pale blue sky, its distant cry drifting between the trees before fading into silence. The German shepherd remained beside the buried container without touching it again. His work, whatever had driven him here so faithfully, seemed complete for the moment. Ethan rested both hands on the cool metal, feeling layers of rust crumble beneath his fingertips. The box was heavier than he expected, anchored not only by damp soil, but also by thick roots that had slowly embraced its corners over countless seasons. Taking care not to force anything, he worked the roots loose one by one until the container finally shifted with a quiet groan. It emerged from the earth inch by inch, carrying the unmistakable scent of old steel, wet clay, and forgotten years. Once it rested on the ground, Ethan carefully wiped away another layer of dirt. Faded olive paint appeared beneath the corrosion, followed by a nearly invisible white stencil that time had almost erased. He traced the letters with one gloved finger before discovering a small brass latch still holding the lid shut. Surprisingly, the latch yielded without much resistance. The hinges protested softly as he lifted the cover, just enough for sunlight to slip inside. He expected empty darkness. Instead, he found order. Every item had been wrapped with remarkable care, protected inside faded oilcloth that had preserved far more than anyone could have imagined. Resting on top was a pair of military identification tags attached to an old steel chain. Ethan lifted them gently, brushing away a film of dust before reading the name stamped into the worn metal. Private First Class Thomas Bennett, United States Marine Corps. The letters remained sharp despite the passing decades. Ethan quietly repeated the name to himself, letting it settle into the stillness around him. Beneath the identification tags rested a neatly folded American flag, smaller than regulation size, carefully protected inside waxed cloth. Beside it lay several black and white photographs with curled edges. One showed a group of smiling young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder outside what appeared to be a training camp. Another captured a German shepherd sitting proudly beside the same young Marine, whose face matched the photograph clipped to the identification file tucked underneath. The resemblance to Atlas was impossible to ignore. Not identical, but unmistakably connected by bloodline and expression. Ethan glanced toward the shepherd, who quietly watched every movement without making a sound. Beneath the photographs rested a leather-bound notebook. The cover had cracked with age, but the pages inside remained remarkably intact. Ethan opened carefully to the first page. Elegant handwriting filled the paper. Not military reports. Not coordinates. Personal thoughts. The first line stopped him completely. If someone ever finds this, please tell my family I never stopped trying to come home. Ethan slowly closed the notebook, suddenly aware that he was no longer holding forgotten belongings. He was holding the final voice of a man history had somehow left behind. The breeze strengthened, stirring the branches overhead until sunlight shimmered across the forest floor like ripples on quiet water. Atlas rose to his feet and walked a few steps away before looking back once more. Ethan noticed the dog's attention was no longer fixed on the box. It was directed farther uphill, toward another cluster of ancient oaks where the ground disappeared beneath dense patches of ivy. Whatever had brought Atlas here had not ended with the discovery beneath their feet. The steel box had answered one question while quietly creating several more. Who was Thomas Bennett? Why had his belongings been hidden instead of returned? And perhaps most troubling of all, if his memories had been buried here for decades, what else had the forest been patiently protecting while the rest of the world slowly forgot his name? Atlas started walking again without a sound, climbing the gentle slope beyond the ancient oaks, while Ethan Walker secured the steel box inside his backpack with careful hands. Every instinct told him to return to town immediately, to contact the local sheriff, or perhaps the Department of Veterans Affairs. Yet another instinct, one sharpened through years of military service, urged patience. Stories like this revealed themselves only to those willing to listen before speaking. The forest remained unusually still as Ethan followed the German shepherd uphill. Fallen leaves softened every footstep, and shafts of afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, illuminating tiny particles drifting lazily in the cool air. The farther they climbed, the older the woods appeared. Massive oak trunks twisted toward the sky, their bark covered with thick blankets of moss, while creeping ivy swallowed broken stone walls that suggested someone had once cared for this forgotten hillside. Atlas slowed beside what looked like the remains of a collapsed split-rail fence, almost invisible beneath decades of overgrowth. He stopped beside a weathered granite marker protruding only a few inches above the forest floor. At first, Ethan assumed it was another natural stone, but after brushing away moss with his glove, faint carved letters emerged beneath the dirt. The inscription had nearly disappeared, leaving only fragments that time had refused to erase. W.I.T. Moore. Ethan quietly repeated the surviving letters. Whitmore. It matched the abandoned farmhouse standing beyond the trees. Whoever had owned this land had left more than empty buildings behind. Atlas lowered his nose near the base of the stone before turning toward a narrow trail that wound through dense cedar trees. Ethan followed until the woods suddenly opened into a small clearing no larger than a suburban backyard. Wildflowers had reclaimed most of the space, surrounding the weathered remains of what had once been a modest wooden cabin. Only its stone chimney remained standing, reaching toward the sky like the final witness to another lifetime. Ethan stepped carefully across the uneven ground, noticing rusted horseshoes, fragments of broken glass, and old square nails half buried beneath layers of leaves. None of it looked disturbed. Everything rested exactly where time had abandoned it. Then Atlas stopped beside the crumbling stone foundation and gently nudged something hidden beneath a loose plank that had somehow survived the passing decades. Ethan lifted the gray board and uncovered a small tin mailbox sealed beneath it. Unlike the military box, this one showed signs of careful protection from moisture. Inside rested a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope bore the same handwriting. Every one was addressed to Private First Class Thomas Bennett. None had ever been opened. Ethan carefully unfolded the first letter. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze as elegant handwriting greeted someone who had apparently never received these words. The letter spoke about an aging father repairing fences, a younger sister graduating from school, and a mother setting one extra place at the dinner table every Sunday because Hope had refused to leave their home. There was no mention of tragedy, no farewell, only quiet faith that Thomas would one day walk through the front door again. Ethan slowly lowered the page, feeling an ache that words could not fully describe. Someone had hidden not only a Marine's belongings, but also every message meant to guide him home. Atlas sat beside him, his calm amber eyes fixed not on the letters, but on the surrounding clearing, as though reminding Ethan that forgotten stories rarely ended with a single discovery. Somewhere beyond the silent trees, another missing piece still waited, and the forest seemed determined to reveal it only one quiet truth at a time. By the time Ethan Walker reached his truck, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the distant ridgeline, washing the countryside in warm amber light. Atlas settled quietly beside the passenger door without needing to be called, as though he had already decided where he belonged. Ethan opened the door, and the German shepherd climbed inside with calm confidence before resting his head near the window, watching the old Whitmore property disappear behind them. Neither seemed ready to leave, but Ethan understood that answers rarely waited forever. 40 minutes later, he parked outside the Ashford Public Library, a modest brick building that had served the county for generations. Inside, the scent of aging paper and polished wood filled the quiet reading room, while sunlight streamed through tall windows onto rows of local history shelves. Behind the front desk sat Eleanor Hayes, a retired schoolteacher who volunteered 3 afternoons each week organizing historical archives. She smiled warmly as Ethan approached, carrying the weathered notebook and several carefully protected photographs. Her expression softened the moment she noticed the faded Marine identification tags resting beside them. She adjusted her glasses and whispered the name slowly. Thomas Bennett. The words seemed to awaken something buried deep within her memory. Eleanor disappeared into the archive room before returning with several thick county record books bound in dark blue cloth. She carefully turned brittle pages until one yellowed newspaper clipping slipped free onto the table. The headline announced the disappearance of a young Marine nearly 40 years earlier. According to the article, Thomas Bennett had returned home on emergency leave after the death of a relative. He was last seen driving toward the Whitmore property before vanishing without explanation. Authorities had searched for weeks before concluding that he had likely left voluntarily. Ethan frowned. Nothing inside the steel box suggested a man preparing to abandon his family. Quite the opposite. Every item had been preserved with care, as though someone expected them to be found one day. Eleanor reached beneath another folder and removed a faded county map. She pointed toward the abandoned farmhouse. The Whitmores sold that land shortly after Thomas disappeared, she said quietly. Most people thought it was simply unfortunate timing. She hesitated before adding, but there were always whispers. Ethan asked what kind of whispers. Eleanor looked toward the nearly empty library before lowering her voice. People said Thomas discovered something on that property. Nobody ever knew what. Then the family moved away within months, and no one spoke about it again. Ethan unfolded one of the black and white photographs from the steel box. Behind the smiling Marines stood the same farmhouse, although it appeared freshly painted and full of life. Near the porch, almost hidden beneath the branches of a large oak, stood an older man wearing work clothes. Eleanor leaned closer. Her eyes widened. "That is Samuel Whitmore," she murmured. "He owned everything out there." Ethan compared the photograph to the county records. Samuel Whitmore had passed away decades earlier, but ownership of the land had transferred through several family members before eventually falling into foreclosure. Every legal document appeared ordinary, yet one detail caught Ethan's attention. A small parcel near the northern edge of the property had never changed ownership. It remained listed under a private trust established the very week Thomas Bennett disappeared. Ethan stared at the survey lines stretching across the faded map. The untouched parcel surrounded the exact hillside where Atlas had first uncovered the military box. As if sensing Ethan's growing realization, the German shepherd, lying patiently beside the library entrance, suddenly lifted his head toward the distant hills beyond town. His ears stood alert, not with fear, but with quiet certainty. Whatever truth had slept beneath the Whitmore land for all those years was larger than one missing Marine, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that one small corner of that forgotten forest would never belong to anyone else. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of low-gray clouds that softened the Virginia hills into quiet shades of silver. Ethan Walker parked just beyond the rusted gate as a light mist drifted between the trees, carrying the familiar scent of wet leaves and rich earth. Atlas stepped from the truck before Ethan could open his own door, pausing only long enough to glance back before disappearing along the narrow trail that now seemed almost routine. Ethan followed without hesitation. The German shepherd no longer searched aimlessly. Every turn was deliberate, every pause measured, as though an invisible path existed beneath the forest floor that only he could sense. They passed the old cabin, crossed the clearing, and continued farther north toward the untouched parcel marked on the county survey. The trees grew denser with every step, their branches weaving together until only scattered patches of morning light reached the ground. Moss covered nearly every fallen log, and the silence felt almost sacred. After nearly half a mile, Atlas slowed beside an enormous limestone ridge where spring water trickled gently from a narrow crack in the rock. The shepherd sniffed the air before walking several yards to the left and stopping beside a weathered cedar stump. He did not bark. Instead, he lowered himself onto the damp ground and stared at Ethan with complete certainty. Ethan studied the area carefully. Unlike the first discovery, there were no obvious signs of disturbed soil. Then he noticed something unusual. Several stones had been arranged in an almost perfect rectangle beneath layers of ivy. Nature rarely worked with such precision. Kneeling beside the formation, he began removing the loose rocks one at a time until a flat wooden panel appeared beneath them. Although darkened by age, the heavy oak cover remained remarkably solid. Ethan lifted one corner slowly. Hidden beneath was a narrow stone chamber no larger than an old root cellar. Cool air escaped from the opening, carrying the dry scent of cedar and aging paper rather than decay. A wooden shelf still stood inside. Resting upon it was a metal document case sealed with thick rubber lining that had somehow survived decades beneath the earth. Ethan carefully carried it into the daylight and opened the latches. Inside rested neatly stacked property deeds, engineering drawings, handwritten financial ledgers, and a leather folder embossed with the Whitmore family crest. As he turned the brittle pages, a pattern slowly emerged. The records described mineral rights beneath the surrounding hills that had never been publicly disclosed. Survey maps revealed valuable limestone deposits extending across neighboring farms. Additional documents showed purchase agreements completed at astonishingly low prices after frightened landowners abandoned their property because of carefully spread rumors about haunted woods and mysterious disappearances. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. The missing Marine had not uncovered treasure. He had uncovered deception. Tucked inside the final folder rested a signed affidavit bearing the unmistakable signature of Thomas Bennett. In calm, steady handwriting, he had documented irregular land records and promised to deliver the evidence to state authorities after returning from leave. The document ended with a single unfinished sentence. "If anything happens before I can submit these papers, the truth is buried where loyalty will one day find it." Ethan slowly lowered the page as the forest fell silent once again. Atlas stepped beside him and rested his head gently against Ethan's shoulder. It was not a gesture asking for praise. It felt more like quiet relief. The shepherd had faithfully guarded a promise that did not belong to him. waiting through passing seasons until someone willing to finish another man's mission finally arrived beneath the ancient trees. Rain arrived just after noon, falling in slow, steady sheets that transformed the forgotten hills into a watercolor of gray skies and dark green forests. Ethan Walker drove carefully toward the Ashford County Sheriff's Office with the recovered evidence secured inside waterproof cases on the seat beside him, while Atlas rested quietly in the back of the truck, watching raindrops race across the windows. The German Shepherd no longer seemed restless. Whatever silent burden had guided him through the woods had begun to lift, yet his alert eyes never strayed far from Ethan, as though reminding him that the journey was not complete until the truth belonged to everyone instead of only the two of them. Sheriff Margaret Collins listened without interrupting as Ethan placed the military box, the unopened family letters, the engineering surveys, and Thomas Bennett's handwritten affidavit across the conference table. She had spent more than 20 years serving Ashford County, long enough to recognize the difference between coincidence and a story that demanded careful attention. One by one, she examined every document, occasionally removing her reading glasses to compare signatures against old county records retrieved from the courthouse archives. The room remained almost completely silent except for the soft tapping of rain against the windows and the turning of fragile pages that had survived 4 decades beneath the earth. Finally, Sheriff Collins leaned back in her chair and released a slow breath. "This explains far more than a missing persons case," she said quietly. "It explains why an entire piece of this county's history never made sense." By late afternoon, she had contacted state investigators, military record specialists, and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. No one dismissed the discovery. The affidavit matched property transfers. The survey maps matched geological reports that had never been made public. Even the photographs confirmed details that old newspaper articles had overlooked for decades. The forgotten puzzle pieces fit together with unsettling precision. Thomas Bennett had uncovered evidence that valuable mineral deposits extended far beyond the Whitmore estate. Rather than allowing neighboring families to learn the true value of their land, influential interests had quietly purchased surrounding properties for a fraction of their worth, while fear and rumors encouraged residents to leave. Thomas had documented the inconsistencies after recognizing altered boundary surveys during his leave home from the Marine Corps. Before he could deliver the evidence, his trail vanished from every official record. There was still no certainty about every event that followed, and Ethan refused to invent answers where none yet existed. What mattered was what could finally be proven. The evidence Thomas protected had survived. His voice had survived. His intention had survived. 2 days later, investigators returned to the forest with archaeologists, historians, and military representatives. Guided by the carefully preserved documents rather than speculation, they respectfully examined the hidden locations Atlas had revealed. Every discovery confirmed another portion of Thomas's account. Additional property markers appeared exactly where his maps indicated. Survey stakes hidden beneath roots aligned perfectly with the forgotten boundary lines described in the recovered ledgers. No dramatic revelation arrived all at once. Instead, truth emerged the way sunrise touches a valley, quietly illuminating what had been there all along. Reporters soon gathered outside the courthouse, but Sheriff Collins spoke with deliberate restraint, explaining only verified facts while emphasizing that the investigation remained focused on historical records and restoring an accurate account of the past. Ethan appreciated her patience. Justice, he had learned during his years in uniform, did not require loud voices. It required honest ones. That evening he returned to the old hillside with Atlas. Rain had ended, leaving thousands of tiny droplets sparkling across every blade of grass beneath the setting sun. Ethan sat beside the ancient oak where the rusted chain had once held the German Shepherd captive. The broken links now rested neatly inside his truck, no longer symbols of imprisonment, but reminders that even the strongest chains eventually surrender to truth. Atlas lay quietly beside him, lifting his head as a gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the trees, church bells echoed faintly through the valley as the first stars appeared above the darkening hills. Ethan looked toward the place where Thomas Bennett's hidden words had waited through countless winters and whispered softly, "Mission accomplished." Atlas closed his eyes for the first time since they had met, and in that peaceful silence it almost seemed as though another faithful soul, long denied the chance to finish his duty, had finally been allowed to rest. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation to Ashford that no one could have imagined at the beginning of autumn. State investigators completed their review of the recovered records, confirming that Thomas Bennett's affidavit had accurately documented hidden property boundaries and intentionally concealed mineral surveys. The forgotten files were officially entered into the county archives, and corrected land records were prepared for the descendants of several families whose farms had been undervalued decades earlier. What had once existed only as whispered rumors became part of the public history of the town, supported not by speculation but by carefully preserved evidence and one Marine's unwavering commitment to honesty. The United States Marine Corps also reopened Thomas Bennett's file. Military historians reviewed the recovered notebook, his identification tags, the unopened letters from home, and every verified document connected to his service. His record was amended to reflect the newly established facts surrounding his disappearance, restoring the honor that had quietly waited beneath the Virginia soil for nearly 40 years. Ethan Walker attended the small ceremony held inside the Ashford Veterans Memorial Hall on a bright October afternoon. There were no television cameras and no elaborate speeches. Rows of American flags stood beside photographs of local service members, while families filled the wooden chairs with respectful silence. An elderly woman slowly approached the front of the room with the careful steps of someone carrying both age and memory. She introduced herself as Emily Bennett, Thomas's younger sister. The last time she had seen her brother, she had been preparing for her high school graduation. She smiled gently as Ethan placed the bundle of unopened family letters into her trembling hands. For several moments, she simply held them against her heart without speaking. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they were not tears of despair. They were the quiet tears that arrive when hope finally catches up with time. Emily thanked Ethan, then knelt beside Atlas. The German shepherd remained perfectly still as she rested her hand upon his broad neck. "Your family never forgot ours," she whispered softly. Atlas closed his eyes and leaned gently into her touch, as though he somehow understood that promises made long ago had finally been fulfilled. After the ceremony, Emily asked Ethan if Atlas belonged to anyone. Ethan looked toward the shepherd, who stood patiently beside the memorial steps, watching golden leaves drift across the courthouse lawn. He smiled. "I think he made that decision the first day we met." Emily laughed through her tears. "Then I believe he chose well." From that afternoon forward, Atlas returned home with Ethan. The old farmhouse Ethan had been restoring soon echoed with simple routines that neither of them had expected to find again. Every morning began with long walks through open fields glowing beneath the Virginia sunrise. Every evening ended on the front porch, where Ethan would read quietly while Atlas rested nearby, listening to the wind moving through distant trees. The nightmares that had often disturbed Ethan after leaving military service became less frequent. Somehow the steady presence of the faithful dog reminded him that not every mission ended with loss. Some ended with healing. One crisp evening, Ethan carefully mounted a framed photograph above the fireplace. It showed a young Marine named Thomas Bennett standing beside his loyal German shepherd many decades earlier. Beneath it rested Thomas's restored identification tags and a folded copy of the letter that had begun with the simple promise that he never stopped trying to come home. Ethan looked toward Atlas lying peacefully on the rug and realized that, in a way no official report could ever explain, Thomas had finally kept that promise. Spring returned to Ashford with quiet confidence, painting the hills in fresh shades of green, while warm sunlight settled across the valleys that had guarded their secrets for so many years. The abandoned Whitmore property no longer stood as a place people hurried past with lowered voices. The county had preserved a portion of the land as a small historical site, leaving the ancient oak exactly where it had always stood. The rusted chain was gone. In its place rested a simple wooden bench overlooking the peaceful forest, inviting visitors to sit, breathe, and remember that truth sometimes asks for patience before it asks to be believed. Ethan Walker visited often, usually with Atlas walking faithfully beside him. Neither of them needed words anymore. Their footsteps followed familiar trails through the woods until they reached the quiet hillside where everything had begun. Wildflowers now covered the clearing that had once hidden forgotten evidence beneath layers of earth. Birds nested among the branches overhead, and the same gentle breeze still carried the scent of cedar, moss, and rich Virginia soil through the trees. It was difficult to imagine that so much silence had once protected so many unanswered questions. One Saturday morning, several local families gathered near the old oak for the dedication of a modest bronze plaque placed beside the bench. It did not tell every detail of the investigation. Instead, it honored the simple values that had guided one Marine and, many years later, another. The inscription read, "In honor of Private First Class Thomas Bennett, whose integrity endured beyond time, and in gratitude for those who refused to let truth remain forgotten." Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, while Emily Bennett placed fresh white lilies beneath the plaque. She smiled toward Atlas, who calmly rested beside Ethan with the same quiet dignity that had first captured his attention months earlier. Children approached the German Shepherd without fear, gently stroking his thick coat while listening to Emily tell the story of courage, loyalty, and hope. She never described Atlas as extraordinary. She simply called him faithful. Somehow that single word seemed larger than every headline the newspapers had printed. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the afternoon settled into peaceful stillness. Ethan remained seated on the wooden bench, watching sunlight dance across the leaves above. Atlas stretched comfortably beside him, his head resting across Ethan's boot exactly as though he had always belonged there. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed Thomas Bennett's restored identification tag. The Marine Corps had returned it after completing the official record update, asking that it remain with the family. Emily, however, had quietly insisted that Ethan keep a duplicate memorial tag created for remembrance. He held the cool metal between his fingers before gently hanging it from a small branch overlooking the trail. It swayed softly in the breeze, catching tiny flashes of afternoon light. No speeches marked the moment. No applause followed. Only the peaceful sound of wind moving through ancient branches and the distant song of a meadowlark drifting across open fields. Ethan smiled as Atlas slowly lifted his head toward the forest one final time before closing his eyes beneath the warm sun. There was nothing left to search for, nothing left to guard. Somewhere beyond sight, another Marine's promise had finally reached home, carried not by fame or fortune but by quiet courage, enduring loyalty, and the faithful heart of a German shepherd who never forgot the path that others had long since stopped looking for. And in that gentle silence, the hills themselves seemed to whisper a truth older than memory, that while time may bury evidence, kindness has a remarkable way of uncovering what the world was never meant to lose.